Tonight, what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you a story. And that's it. I'm just going to tell you a story. And then before we leave, I'm going to leave you with a challenge. I'm going to keep it very simple. I want you to remember one word tonight. And that's simply this: story. Now, we know that the best author of all time is God. He is the author. He is the finisher of our faith. If you have your Bibles, and if you don't, you can listen on. But one of my favorite Bible stories, and Craig, you talked about it today, is a story of Joseph. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read just a few verses in Genesis chapter 41. Before I do that, I want to tell you just a little bit about myself. People oftentimes ask me, Jaime, do you travel a lot? I say, well, actually, I do travel quite a bit. And they say, why do you do that? And then I say, let me show you a picture of my family. My wife and I have been married. This summer will be 22 years. We got married very young. And we have 6 daughters. That's right. Now, the part that they don't see in the picture is that 4 of those are teenagers. Well, one thinks she's a teenager. And then we have my niece, who's 18, who goes to college, and she lives with us 5 nights a week. So if you're counting, that's now 7 women. Are you with me? And then up until this past weekend, we had a female, a single lady, who was living in the apartment attached to our house. How many are we at? That's 8. And then we have a female dog. So some say I'm blessed, some say I'm cursed, and both are true. But I like to think that I am blessed. I'm a rich man, not in the way the world might see, but if you met my wife, you would know that I'm not only a rich man, I'm a good salesman. Genesis chapter 41, starting in verse 41, and we're just going to read a few verses here. It says this: So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, Make way! Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Verse 44, Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt. It's a good story, isn't it? If you were to turn over to Genesis chapter 45, verses 4 to the beginning of 8, you would see that Joseph has now revealed himself to his brothers. And 3 times he said, God sent me. It wasn't you, it was God who sent me. But you see, stories like this, we like. We like to get to the end of the story and everything turns out great. But the problem with this story of Joseph is this was not the beginning of the story. This was the end of the story. And as we work our way through Joseph's life, he was betrayed by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He then rose up to the top of Potiphar's house. He was thrown into prison because he was a man of integrity. He then served in the prison and rose up to run the prison. And then the butler and the baker were thrown in there. And the baker, when he went back, or was it the butler? It was the butler. When he went back, he forgot Joseph until Pharaoh had a dream. See, that was not the fun part of the story. My mom, who is the angel of our family, other than my wife, But growing up, she's an amazing lady, and she makes phenomenal cookies. But my mom, when she reads a book of suspense, what she'll do is she'll read the first chapter, then she skips to the end and reads the last chapter. And then because she knows how it ends, she doesn't have to worry about the rest of the story. Now you think that's great, but you know what? God did that for us as well. He wrote the end of the story so we know how the story ends. So if we are truly following Christ, we shouldn't have to worry about the rest of the story because we know the end. The story I'm going to tell you tonight started back in the 1950s. It's a story that partly is communicated in the movie or the book End of the Spear. There's a documentary, Beyond the Gates of Splendor. That's the real people telling that story, but tonight I'm going to tell you that story. I'm going to tell you more than what's portrayed in these. My grandfather was a missionary pilot, serving missionaries who lived out in the Amazon rainforest. And as he would fly over the rainforest, there was one area of the rainforest that he would fly over that no other pilots would fly over. At that time, it was known as Alka territory. Now, Alka is a derogatory term that outsiders called these Indians because nobody had ever gotten close enough to find out what they called themselves, at least, and lived to tell about it. They called themselves the Waodani, which means true people. In late 1955, my grandfather, flying over this area of the jungle, he spotted one of the clearings where there was an Alka or a Waodani house. Now, the reason no other pilots would fly over there is because of the people who lived there. If they made it out alive after the plane crash, they would never make it out of that area alive because of the people who live there. Now, to understand the story I'm going to tell you tonight, I need to tell you about these people. The Waodani people are an egalitarian society. That means there's no laws of any kind. Nobody tells anybody else what to do. You can do whatever you want, whenever you want, and there's nobody to tell you differently. I thought that'd be really cool when I was a teenager, and I think my teenagers would think that that's really cool today. But there did become 4 unwritten rules that everybody lived by. And in order to understand this story I'm going to tell you tonight, you need to understand these 4 rules. Rule number 1, if somebody does something that you do not like, ignore it. Rule number 2, if somebody does something that you don't like and you can't ignore it, kill them. Rule number 3, if somebody kills somebody in your family group, it's not only your right, it's your obligation to kill somebody in their family group. Rule number 4, if, whether you've been offended or to avenge a death in your family group, you're going to kill somebody in another family group, take your whole family group with you, kill the whole other family group. That way there's nobody left to come kill you or your family. They were a society of death. Anthropologists who have since studied this tribe have called them the most violent society to have ever existed on this planet that's been studied. They had in excess of a 60% homicide rate inside the tribe. But my grandfather knew what this book says is true, that in the last day, there will be people from every tribe and nation and kindred and tongue who are before God's throne willingly giving him praise. And he said, doesn't that include these people? So he put together a group of 5 men. So it was my grandfather Nate Saint, Jim Elliott, Roger Udarian, Pete Fleming, and Ed McCulley, young men between the ages of 27 and 32 years old. My grandfather, being 32, was the oldest. And they said, we need to reach these people with the gospel. So for 13 weeks at the end of 1955, after locating that clearing, my grandfather did what's called the bucket drop. It was a way that he could give gifts to the Indians without getting close to the Indians. What he would do is he would fly his little Piper airplane in tight circles, about 500 feet above the ground. 500 feet, that's about 150 meters. Okay. And he would let out about 350 meters of line that would go out behind the airplane with a bucket at the end. And as he would work himself in these tight circles, the bucket would actually fly in the opposite direction until it hung motionless below the airplane. And as he would let out more line, the bucket would go straight down. When he brought in line, the bucket would come straight up. He gave gifts like machetes, pots and pans, things that the Indians normally would kill outsiders to get. Well, pretty soon, they built a platform about 5 meters high on which to receive the bucket. They also began giving gifts back. Things like a toucan feathered headdress. You guys know what a toucan is? Okay, long. It's a meat-eating bird with a very long beak. If you had Fruit Loops here, you would know that it's the Fruit Loops bird. So if those of you who know Fruit Loops, you know that that's the toucan. They also got things like combs that people in the jungles had made. They also got roasted monkey meat. Has anybody had roasted monkey meat? Nobody? Do you want to know what it tastes like? What? I heard it. You do want to know. What do you think it might taste like? No, people normally think chicken. No, it tastes just like toucan. You'll get that on the way home, those of you who didn't get that yet. So after 13 weeks, they realized it was time. My grandfather had located a beach about 200 meters long on the edge of the Iwanguno or Kururai River. And he said, it's time to make contact. In the book, End of the Spear, my dad recorded copied some of my grandfather's journals in the days leading up to his death. I don't have the book with me, but I'd like to tell you what he wrote. And I have a cheat sheet here just in case. He said this. Now, this is a 32-year-old man who's about to go into the most violent society to have ever existed on this planet. And he said this. As we have a high old time this Christmas, may we who know Christ hear the cry of the damned as they hurtle headlong into a Christless eternity. Would that we could comprehend the lot of these Stone Age people who live in mortal fear of death on the jungle trail. Those to whom the bark of a gun means sudden, mysterious death. Those who think all men in all the world are killers like themselves. If God would grant us the vision, the word sacrifice would disappear from our lips and thoughts. We would hate the things that seem now so dear to us. We would charge the enemy with all our energies in the name of Christ. May we who know Christ, may God help us to judge ourselves by the eternities that separate the Alkas from a comprehension of Christmas. And him who, though he was rich, yet for our sakes became poor, so that we might through his poverty be made rich. Friday, January 6, 1956, the men had been on the beach for a couple days. Every evening, my grandfather would fly his airplane out to Arahuno, because in the Amazon rainforest, if it rained upriver, which it does, they get about 10 meters of rain every year. If it rained upriver, the river could flood by 3 or 4 feet, a meter overnight. Every morning he would fly the airplane back. Well, on Friday, January 6th, out of the jungles came 2 young ladies and a young man. There was no animosity. There was no hostility of any kind. They ended up spending the day together on the beach. My grandfather actually gave the man that they nicknamed George, his tribal name is Nankiwi, gave him at least 2 rides in his airplane. He got into the airplane because he was fascinated by it. And my grandfather realized he wanted maybe to see his village from the air, his clearing. And so my grandfather flew him over the village and flew him back. It was 2 ridges over from the beach. And Nankiwi didn't get out of the airplane. You see, he didn't want to see his clearing from the air. He wanted, if anybody was there, them to see him. Much like if you or I were to get a new car. We really don't care who we see when we're driving. We do care who sees us. So my grandfather took him back over, and Nankiwi started stepping out on the strut of the airplane. And being a pilot myself, I can only imagine what was going through my grandfather's mind. But then I can also imagine what he must have been thinking about how to get Nankiwi back in the airplane. Their tribal outfit was very easy to keep clean, but it didn't consist of a whole lot. It simply was a string that went around the waist. That's it. Now the ladies, if they were being very fashionable, they could wear it around their elbow or around their knee. But men always wore it around the waist. Fortunately, Nankiwi did make it back safely in the airplane and they landed. Later in the afternoon, the younger of the 2 ladies and Nankiwi, they left the beach. The older of the 2 ladies, who at this time was probably about 30 years old, which was very old by tribal standards, she stayed until just before dawn. The men were ecstatic. They had been given this opportunity by God to have the first friendly contact, and they knew what the next chapter was going to hold. That they were going to be able to share the love and the goodness of God with these people who so desperately needed it. Saturday came and there was no contact. Sunday morning, still none, and so my grandfather flew over the beach. And as he was flying back, he was looking down into the rainforest, but in the Amazon, there's 3 layers of canopies, so you can't see anything when you're looking down, except at the river. And the river snakes back and forth and all around, and as he was going back to the beach, he looked down and he saw them coming towards the beach. And he called my grandmother. He said, "Marge, it looks like they're coming for the afternoon service. I'll call you again at 4 o'clock. But 4 o'clock came and there was no contact. My grandfather's watch had stopped shortly after 3 o'clock, as his body, having been pierced with many spears, had been thrown into the river. All 5 men dead. How can this be? Were they not being obedient to what God had called them to do? How could God let this happen to them? You see, in church today, we like verses in the Bible like Romans 8:28. Raise your hand if you can quote Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to His purpose. Now, who can quote for me 2 Timothy 3:12? If you do, I'll give you a choice of movie. 2 Timothy 3:12. Who can do it? Nobody? All who live godly in Christ Jesus shall live happily ever after. Your Bible doesn't say that? It says all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. It's normal. It's expected. If you're not facing persecution, you're probably not living godly. I'm not going to focus on there, but I tell you that will preach. Just not to many people because we don't like to hear that. You see, that wasn't the end of this story. It was just the end of one chapter of this story. 2 years later, as the next chapter opened, my great Aunt Rachel, Nate's sister, along with Elizabeth Elliott, were invited in to live with the tribe. Dayuma, from this family group, who had fled the killings years earlier, had been living with my great Aunt Rachel. They were invited in. 2 years after that, my dad was invited in for the first time. He was about 9 years old. A short time after being in the jungles, Minkai, the man who killed my grandfather, he went to Aunt Rachel. He said, Nemo. Her name means star. He said, Nemo, how can Baba be this old and not know how to live? You see, in the jungles, if you didn't know how to hunt or how to track, how to use a blowgun or how to use a spear, you didn't know how to live. And Aunt Rachel turned back to Minkai and said, Minkai, you having spear killed his father, who do you say should teach him how to live? And Minkai left. You see, if you remember those 4 laws, if he teaches my dad how to hunt and how to track, how to use a blowgun and how to use a spear, he's really giving him the tools and the training necessary to avenge his dad's death by killing Minkai or members of Minkai's family. Minkai came back that afternoon. He said, it's true. Having spear killed his father, I myself would teach him how to live. But the depth of that was not known until later, and we realized that Minkai had not just agreed to teach my dad how to live, he had actually adopted my dad as his own son. People oftentimes ask me, how can you possibly forgive the people who killed your grandfather? They ask my dad, how can you forgive somebody who killed your dad? You know what my dad says? He says, we've never forgiven them. We didn't have to. You see, for years, my grandfather and my grandmother had been praying for these people. After my grandfather went in and they realized he was dead, they continued to pray for these people. When Aunt Rachel went in, they continued to pray for these people. So by the time my dad went in at 9 years old, he thought, these people must be the most special people that God has ever created. I think it's more unusual when we expect people who don't know anything about Christ that they should not live like the world would live. These people killed all the time. By killing somebody in our family, it made us more part of them than it made us different from them. We've never forgiven them. We never had to. Have we been reconciled? Yes, we have. Because you see, Minkai and many members of Minkai's family, they had heard about Jesus. Itota, Wangongi's only son, who was sent to this earth to mark a trail with his own blood to follow, and he left us carvings so that we could follow that good trail. And when we come to the end of that trail, we come to where he is. In 1994, Aunt Rachel died of cancer, just 2 years after finishing not only helping to develop a written language for these people, but also having helped to translate the New Testament into their own language. When she died, my dad went down for the funeral, and after the funeral, Dawa, who would be his tribal aunt or grandmother, came to him and said, Baba, now that Nemo is dead, we say that you, being part of our family, you come with your family and you live with us. And my dad said, no. And Dawa said, well, Nemo, Aunt Rachel said that you would come. Now, if you had known Aunt Rachel, you knew it would do you no good to argue with her when she was living. But much now she's truly living, but her body is dead. It was no good to argue with her, so my dad used a typical church excuse or ministry excuse. He said this, he said, I'll pray about it. Because how does somebody else know what God tells you? But Dawa turned back to the people. She said, in Yunani. She said, having already spoken to Wangongi, the Creator God, I know that He sees it well. So my dad, thinking quickly on his feet, he said, people, in Yunani. He said, speaking to Wangongi, the Creator, and speaking to Ongin Kamo. That's my mom. Both of them seeing it well surely will come. You see, my mom was in Florida. And even if there was a way to communicate from the middle of the Amazon to Florida in the United States, they didn't speak the same language. So he knew he had them. But Dawa again turned to the people. She said, people, Ongin Kamo being a Christ follower, if God sees it well, how can she not see it well? So in 1995, 2 weeks after I graduated from high school, we moved down to live with the Waodani people. And we said, okay, what do you want us to do for you? And they said, no, we don't want you to do anything. Foreigners are always coming and doing for us. But you, we want you to teach us so that we also can fulfill Christ's Great Commission. You see, we like to say Matthew 28, go and make disciples. And 2 Timothy 2:2, do it all the way to 4 generations. Make disciples who can make disciples who can make disciples. We learned that from Foundations for Farming this week. So they said, doesn't God's Great Commission say that all Christ followers should be doing things to reach their people? We said it's true. They said, okay. They said, when foreigners come and do for us, there's a couple problems. Number one, all they can do is meet the physical need. Whether it's medical, whether it's dental, whether it's aviation to fly them out. They said, but our people have a bigger need than a physical need. They have a spiritual need. The second problem is, they said when foreigners come, they only come when it's convenient for them, not when we have a need. They said, if you teach us those things, we can not only help them when they have a problem, but we can also tell them how God can fix their hearts. It made a lot of sense, but how do you take somebody from the Stone Age all the way up to the Space Age in one step? There was a dentist who had come down and heard that our family was living out with the Waodani. And he said, look, and this tribe is very famous outside of Ecuador. And he said, look, if you will take me out for a couple of days, I'll fix as many people's teeth as I can, and then before I have to leave. My dad said, on one condition. You teach them what you know. Well, this guy wanted a story to tell us, so he said, sure, but this guy had been a dentist for 20 years. And it takes in the United States about 20 years of schooling to become a dentist. So how is he going to teach in 2 days what took him 40 years to learn? So what he allowed the Indians to do is hold his instruments while he worked. So at the end of the first day, he had fixed a lot of people's teeth. As the second day started, he fixed several people's teeth, and then he gave a lady a shot of anesthetic. And if you know anything about anesthetic, it takes about 5 or 10 minutes for your mouth to get numb. So he went across the clearing to where my parents lived, and he got a glass of lemonade. When he came back, the tooth that he was going to work on was already drilled. And if you were a dentist, you know that when you drill out a tooth, you have to undercut the tooth so the filling, when you put a filling in, the filling won't fall out. And whoever drilled it had also undercut it. Well, he didn't speak the language, so he went and got my dad, who does speak the language, and he said, Steve, I thought you told me nobody out here knows anything about dentistry. He said, they don't. He said, no, Steve, I've been a dentist for 20 years. Whoever drilled out this tooth, they know what they're doing. They have had training. Well, rather than argue about it, they decided to ask the people. They said, hey, who did this? And nobody answered. Remember, they don't yet know if this is a good thing or a bad thing that they've done. But finally we saw Tamenta in the back of the room, and Tamenta had a little bit of a sheepish grin on his face. Firstly, because he had had a fish hook when he was younger stuck in his cheek, and they ripped it out. So one side of his face doesn't work real well. The other side was smiling because he was the guy that had done it. And we said, Tamenta, Bito dia, did you do this? He said, well, she had already been given the thorn, so she wasn't going to feel anything. What harm could I do? And this dentist realized that just by watching him for 2 days, they were able to duplicate what he had done. We had also taken down a light sport aircraft as a company baggage on the airline. And the 85-pound engine was a carry-on. You can't do that anymore. We were assembling that in Shell on the edge of the jungles, close to where my grandparents had been stationed, when a group of Quechua Indians came by and they saw the Waodani working on an airplane. And they said, man, if they can do it, we can do it too. Because in Ecuador, the Indian class is the lowest class. But there's lots of Indians. Within the Indian class, the Waodani are the lowest because they were the ones who killed. And so when the Quechua Indians saw the Waodani, they said, man, we can do it too. So they came up and they asked our family, hey, when you're done teaching them, will you teach us? My dad said no. It was everything that we could do to try to teach the Waodani the things that they had wanted to learn. When the Quechuas left, the Waodani turned to us and they said, don't you understand? You teaching us, together we'll teach everybody. And that was the birth of the idea that became known as ITEC, the Indigenous Peoples Technology and Education Center. That's where I work full-time today. At ITEC, our mission is to develop tools to train and equip Indigenous Christ followers around the world to meet the physical needs of their own people as a door opener for the gospel. We were here in May with Foundations for Farming. 3 people, only one who was from ITEC, were trained by Foundations for Farming. And then we did a mechanical training and an iFilm training, storytelling on film. If I was to ask you how many of you have one of these, probably most of you would lift it up. Everybody in all the world, every place I've been, just about everybody has one of these. Even in places where there's no cell phone signal, if there's a photo opportunity, everybody whips out their smartphone and starts taking pictures. So today we travel around the world training pastors and church leaders, mature Christ followers, how to meet the physical needs of their own people so that they can have the opportunity to share Christ. And I could tell you story after story after story about them, but time does not allow that tonight. But the key is when we leave, the work continues. When a medical group goes, they do a good thing, but they only really put a Band-Aid on the wound. And there's a couple problems with that. When we were living with the Waodani, there was another dentist who had come, and he had spent 2 days working on people's teeth. Well, when people in the jungles heard about that, everybody comes from all their villages, and there's about 32 villages. And the jungle trail is very harsh. And a lot of them, by the time they get there, the dentist is leaving. And they made this comment. They said, now that their teeth don't hurt anymore, our teeth hurt more. So by doing a good thing, potentially we also do harm because we can create animosity within a people group. But today when we go and we teach how to do extractions, on day 1, and we normally have people from several different areas, all in the same country, but 2 people from each location who will go back and work together. We read that in this book, that the guy who is this book, he sent his disciples out 2 by 2 because there's strength in numbers. So when they come in for a dental training, the first day is just classroom training. They're learning the anatomy of the teeth, how many roots each tooth has, where the nerves run on all the teeth. At the end of the day, they have to give and receive a shot of anesthetic. And so they come in twos, so they team up, and they have to both give and receive. And this is how we know, again, another confirmation that the Bible is true. It is more blessed to give than to receive. So people with typically no medical training or dental training of any kind, you see them giving a block shot in the back of the mouth, and their hand is shaking. You're just really glad that you're watching and not in the chair. Day 2, we teach the different tools that are necessary to extract different teeth. Forceps, curettes, elevators, and the list goes on. And then we teach sterilization. The Bible says it's a good thing to share, but there are certain things that we don't want to share. And so by sterilizing the instruments, we make sure that 100% of any living organism that is still on those instruments dies. Because if one person comes in with HIV, with hepatitis, we want to make sure that it stays with them and nobody else. In the afternoon of day 2, they start working on real people. And our dentists are working very closely, hands-on, for about 3 days. By Friday, if they start on Monday, by Friday they're coaching. And on Saturday, they have to start the clinic before the dentists show up, and they end the clinic after the dentists leave. But you know what? In the world today, one of the biggest killers is disease that originates in the mouth. People around this world, and probably in this room today, have hurting teeth. If you've ever had an abscessed or infected tooth, it's all you can think about. And so when you go in and you preach Jesus to them, they don't want to hear it because they have a hurting tooth. But if you can take care of that hurting tooth, you have them for 30 to 45 minutes in your chair, and you know what? You have a captive audience. And you can tell them about Jesus as you're taking out the infected tooth. And when they wake up the next morning after a good night's rest and their tooth doesn't hurt anymore, you know what they're going to do? They're going to think about what you told them about Jesus. I think I have about 7 to 10 minutes. Here's how I want to wrap up tonight. Back in the early 2000s, I had a conversation with God. I said, God, I will go anywhere and do anything you want me to do except work at iTech. I said, I'll go anywhere. I'll do anything. I will not do that. But I heard my dad say something, and then I saw my grandmother's testimony. And my grandmother's testimony in the days leading up to her death, this is Nate's wife. She had that morning had 6 liters of fluid drained off her abdomen. She had cancer for the 3rd time. She was very weak, but my dad had promised his siblings that he would at least try to get her life story on film. So she agreed to do it, and she got changed into a dress and sat in a chair, and she began to recount her life. She said, when I was a young nurse, there was a real live missionary who came to our town. And as soon as my shift was over, I ran to get to the church, but the only seats left were in the second balcony, all the way in the back. She said, I couldn't believe that there was a real missionary who had come to our town. And she said, at the end, this missionary said, who of you will give your lives to serve God? And she said, before I knew what I was doing, I was down from that second balcony. I was walking that aisle, and I went up and I prayed this. She said, God, your will for my life at any cost. And she said, I had no idea how much it would cost me. She said, I lost my first husband prematurely. Then I spent the next 10 years raising my 3 kids. And then I married a widower, and I lost him also. She said, I've had cancer for the 3rd time. She said, it's been difficult. It's been not an easy life. She said, if I could go back all the way to that church, she said, I would still say, your will for my life at any cost. In 2006, I was traveling up to Washington, D.C. for a large youth conference where they had asked me to speak. And a buddy of mine had traveled with me, and I finished the book I was reading, and he handed me another book. It's called How to Support Your Pastor. And there was one excerpt in there, one chapter, it was this Baptist. I think we're in a Presbyterian church. No? Okay. Well, you got to be careful with these things. So it was a Baptist minister who was speaking to college students, and he said this. He said, children, one day you're going to die. They're going to take your body out, and they're going to dig a hole and put it in the ground. Then, like Baptists do, they're going to go back to church, and they're going to eat potato salad. He said, when you came into this world, you were the only one crying. Everybody else was happy. He said, when you leave this world, are people going to be crying, or are they going to be happy to see you go? When they go back and they eat their potato salad at church, are they going to be talking about your titles or about your testimonies? I went to the University of Florida for my undergraduate degree, my only degree. And there was a girl who was a couple years younger than me. But she, after her freshman year, she lived in the same apartment complex, and we knew each other. So she went to her dad after her freshman year, and she said, Dad, I want to take a year off of school and travel with, it was called Carpenter's Tools, part of Youth for Christ. She said, I want to spend a year of my life, and I want to travel with them. We're going to travel around the United States, and then we're going to go to several places around the world. She said, may I go? And her dad said no. She said, but Dad, if I take a year of my life and only have a significant impact on one person, isn't that enough? And he said, no, you're the only girl on our entire side of the family. No, it's not good enough. But finally, he agreed to let her go. She traveled for that year, and the day she came back, she had just led a group to Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. That night, as her family was having a welcome home party, a celebration, she complained of a headache. She asked her dad to pray and ask God to take her headache away. And he did. She went into a coma and she died. She was 20 years and 20 days old. She was my sister. You see, verses like Romans 8:28 sound really good. And we like to quote that. But we don't bring in the 2 Timothy 3:12. But let me put those two verses together like this. God has a story to write with your life. He doesn't promise that every chapter is going to be easy. In fact, he promises that there will be difficult chapters in your life. But he does promise that if you allow him to write your story, he will make sense of even the most difficult chapters before the story is over. I know in North America we have a tendency, we want to write our story and we say, God, you edit my story. God doesn't offer to be our editor. We like to say there was a book that came out after World War II that said, God is my co-pilot. God doesn't offer to be your co-pilot. He wants to fly the airplane you're in. He wants to write His story with your life. It'd be a whole lot easier to say, God, you write my story if we knew the end of the story. But guess what? We do. We know the end of the story. We know that in the end, God wins. He is a faithful God. He is a faithful author. He is a faithful creator. We can trust Him to write His story with our lives. So my challenge to you tonight is this: let God write your story. Many of you have probably been wondering what this is around my neck. This is the baga. And these are wild pig teeth. In the jungles, the wild boar is one of the most dangerous animals to the Waodani. And so Minkai has told me, he said, when you go and you speak life, you wear your baga. But you know what? Tonight, there are people here who speak life on a daily basis. This is a baga. This is handmade in the jungles of Ecuador. It's the only place you can possibly get one. And so tonight, Craig, if you would come up here. Foundations for Farming is speaking life into your lives and giving you cause and reason to speak lives into those people that you come in contact with every day. I would be remiss if I didn't put this around your neck. As a member of the Waodani tribe myself, Craig, as you go and you continue to do what you do, continue to speak life.